Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, and today's video we are diving into the 80s, some backlist horror, to read some of the winners of the Bram Stoker Awards from the 1980s. The Bram Stoker Awards were created by the Horror Writers Association, and the organization was created in 1987, and that was the first year that the Bram Stoker Awards came to be as well. So I thought it'd be really fun to dive into some 1980s horror and read the Superior Achievement in a Novel winners for the 3 years in the 80s that this award was available for. And I want to make it very specific that the Bram Stoker Awards website says that the awards are given for superior achievement, not for best of the year. So these 3 books that I'm going to be reading in this vlog all come from the novel category. There are a bunch of different categories and they're very interesting to look through. There's one for first novel, like a debut novel, short story collection, so on and so forth, but I just decided to focus on the novels. So in this vlog, I'm going to be reading the Bram Stoker winners for novel for 1987, 1988, and 1989. So the 1987 award actually was a tie, and it looks like, based on their system, this is something that can happen and has happened a couple of times. So that was actually a tie between Misery by Stephen King and another book. So I have already read Misery by Stephen King and really appreciated it. I'm not going to reread it for this vlog, but I did just want to give it its flowers because it did tie with another book for superior achievement in a novel, and it tied with Swan Song by Robert McCammon, which is going to be one of the books that I'm reading for this vlog. This is a very, very dense book, so I'm a little intimidated. The 1988 winner for superior achievement in a novel is Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs. Now, this one I have actually read before as well. However, unlike Misery, which I just read in the past 3 years, this is a book that I have not read since I was in either early high school, late middle school, and for context, I am 30, so it has been quite a long time since I've read this one. So I do want to give this a reread, read it with fresh adult eyes, and just kind of see my thoughts on it because it has been over a decade since I've last read this one. I do remember enjoying it. I remember enjoying the movie, and I do think that this book really set me up for a lot of tropes and themes that I enjoy in horror as an adult. So I am really excited to revisit this one and read The Silence of the Lambs. And then the last book I'm going to be reading for this vlog is the 1989 winner, and that is going to be Carrion by Dan Simmons. And this one is, I'm going to be completely honest, the one I'm the most worried about, just because at the very end of last year I actually read the short story Carrion, which this was originally a short story. It was transformed into a novel, and I read it in a short story collection and was without a doubt one of the standouts in that collection. It was my first experience with this author, and I was really intrigued. I love vampires. I thought this concept was really cool, and I was really excited to get to this novel. However, at the beginning of this year, I read The Terror by this author, and I really appreciated a lot of what was going on there, but I really did not like a lot about it, and I'm nervous to dive into something that is a significant amount of pages from this author again because of the pacing issues and the characterization issues in The Terror. I did not like especially how the women and how Indigenous people were portrayed in The Terror, so I am cautiously giving this author a second chance because for this vlog, why not? And because I had already been interested in reading Carrion. So second chance for this author for me, and I'm just a little bit nervous just because I know it's another thick, chunky book, and I haven't had success with the long form of this author in the past, but we're gonna go in, we're gonna try and go in with a blank slate and see if I like this one a little bit more. So those are my reading plans for this vlog. I'm very excited to read some more backlist horror. I've read a lot of brand new releases this year, and I think it's gonna be fun to read some 1980s horror. So I'm gonna kick off this vlog with The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. I'm gonna go get to reading, and I will check back in later with a reading update. So I am now about 30% of the way through The Silence of the Lambs, and I'm just really enjoying this one so far. From chapter 1, Thomas Harris's prose has just immediately captured me, drawn me into this story. I was really excited to revisit this book, and I was a little interested to see how I would feel because I do know this story so well. I've seen the movie, I have read this book before, albeit a very long time ago, but I was really curious to see how this reading experience would go. And this is definitely a book where even if you have seen the movie, I would still recommend the book because it's just such an enjoyable read. This is just such a well-crafted book. So in this book, we follow main character Clarice Starling, and she is a student at the FBI Academy when she gets a interesting call from the FBI director wanting her help to interview a very infamous serial killer named Dr. Hannibal Lecter. So she goes on this assignment. Crawford, who is the FBI director, has a lot of promise and faith in her, and she's really excited and eager to showcase her potential. So she goes and she has this interview with Lecter. It does not go how anyone expects because he has been very closed off since his arrest, and he starts this interesting back and forth cat and mouse sort of rapport with Clarice. Now, also going on during this time, the FBI is furiously trying to catch this serial killer nicknamed Buffalo Bill, and he has been kidnapping and holding women for about a week before murdering them and disposing of their bodies. The FBI have been trying to catch him to no avail. However, Dr. Hannibal Lecter might have some insights to help this case move further along, and he will only share these insights with Clarice Starling. So Clarice really gets thrown into this investigation that normally she wouldn't be privy to because it is like the top priority for the FBI at this time, and she's not even a graduate of the program, and she's also a woman, so during this time she gets underestimated a lot. So we're seeing her kind of start to form these very interesting relationships, not only with people like Crawford wanting to help her through this process, through the bureaucracy, and other people who may not trust her as much as he does because of her inexperience, lack of expertise. She is still technically a student, and also the fact that she is a woman, and then also this very interesting back and forth with Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who sees something in Clarice and seems to want to help her catch Buffalo Bill, but she really doesn't know why he would want to help her do this. So I'm really loving this story. The character work is absolutely evidence. Clarice is a very easy character to root for, and I really do love like an FBI sort of procedural in the movies that I watch, TV shows that I watch, and crime horror fiction that I read. I do generally like the premise of an FBI agent. And what I mean by that is an FBI agent being the main character, following them investigating a case. I think that is so fascinating. I love the way that this is built up because we get to see all sorts of different rabbit chases and different like rabbit holes to go down as Clarice is getting a lot of different input about different little aspects that may seem like small, inconsequential details that could just really open this case up. Like even going to places like the Smithsonian and interviewing people who have a very special interest, a special niche in different various, I'm trying not to give too much away, but who have very specific niches, and going to them, getting that information and putting it all together. I just think that is just so fascinating to read from. So 30% of the way in, I'm absolutely loving it. Cannot wait to continue reading. this is going to be a very short, very sweet little update, but I am 70% of the way through The Silence of the Lambs. I've just been sitting here reading it and I'm just so completely absorbed in this book. I have a feeling that once I finish this, I'll definitely want to see if I can track down the movie somewhere and watch it, because I'm really enjoying this story. And then I think if I don't manage to find the movie somewhere, I do think I'll probably want to read at least one other Thomas Harris book before the end of the year. So I think there are 3 other books, and I think this series, like Hannibal Lecter is the not main character, but like key component. Like I think they all have to deal with him in some way. So I don't actually know if we'll get Clarice in any of the other books, because I'm not familiar with them as I am familiar with this story. But yeah, 70% of the way in, and I'm just having a great time with this book so far. I finished The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, and I really loved this one. What a great start to the vlog. So much so that I just kind of want to abandon all of my other reading plans and continue on with this series. I had such a great time with this book, and not to give too much away about the ending, but I am very surprised that not only, like, I read this before obviously, but I'm very surprised I didn't go out and seek other books in this series. I will say this does kind of wrap up pretty definitively on its own, but it is a 4-book series, and I'm just surprised that it's taken me until now to not only reread this book, but also want to continue on with this story. I think what is really interesting to see here, and what I think will continue to be interesting throughout this reading vlog, is seeing how well that the Horror Writers Association picked out the outstanding books of the year, because when I was looking at these book selections, the winners are all books that we continue to hear a lot about, right? Like The Silence of the Lambs, I think, is the most common. I feel like even people who aren't well versed in horror fiction, they've heard of this book or this movie. But the other 2 books that I'm reading for this vlog, I've also heard. People are still reading them, people are still picking them up, and of course we can wonder, like, kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Are they still in public discourse because they won awards like the Bram Stoker Award and people keep reading them, or are they just genuinely that good and the Bram Stoker Awards managed to pick books that transcend time and are really popular even decades later? When I was trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to do for this vlog, I was considering whether reading just the winners of this category or just reading all of the nominees for Outstanding Novel, and some of them are very hard to find. The runners-up, the other nominees, I have found there are some books that I have heard of, but a lot of them never heard of them before, and my library, it's very hard to track down copies of them. So I do think that's very interesting with the winners of at least these 3 years, that the books that ended up winning are definitely the ones that I've heard the most about and are the most popular. So yeah, I really did enjoy this one. It came out in the 80s, and I think that this one is, of course, a little dated. Everything is a product of its time, but it does hold up fairly well. I think Clarice Starling is a really excellently done female main character, and I always want to point out it's very impressive when a male author can do that, and I'm sure vice versa. I'm just speaking from my personal experience. A lot of times when I'm reading from male authors, sometimes you can tell that a man is writing it and not a woman, but this Clarice, she just rocked. I really enjoyed her character, and I think books like this one show that you don't have to write main characters that are not identical to your own identity or experiences. You just have to lock in, get it right, take your time, and do some research. She's great. She's great, and I really did enjoy this book. I was surprised by how funny this was, both with Clarice. She's got an internal dialogue, and as she's making her way through all of these investigative sort of hurdles, she's very funny, and Hannibal Lecter is very funny as well. I just thought there were a lot of wry moments and moments that I was chuckling to myself that this is very, very funny. I think that this book does a really good job in particular of really endearing you in some ways to Dr. Lecter, and you know from the beginning he's a bad man. He's murdered people, he's eaten people, and just the way that it's set up and the conversations that he has with Clarice, and the ways in which sometimes he's almost set up like as someone who's helping her when no one else is, when she is encountering horrible sexism from the director of the mental institution that he's in. Sometimes you feel yourself rooting for him. He's very enigmatic, and that's very chilling because you almost feel groomed in a way by the end, that you're not exactly rooting for him all the way, but you're not rooting for him either. I mean, he does some horrific things in this book as well, but I thought it was quite fascinating how sometimes he is Clarice's champion. He is championing Agent Starling when sometimes no one else is in her corner. So it feels very weird to be getting that dynamic and just really feeling that pull towards him, and that's very, very chilling. Now, I did mention this book is from the 80s, so we do get some fat phobia. I think that's the biggest issue with this book. Now, of course, Buffalo Bill, he has a set victimology, and that's not the part that's fat phobic. He goes after larger mid-sized to plus-size women, and when talking about that, that's not quite so fat phobic, but I did find that the conversations people were having about these women, these victims, I thought were just a little bit, obviously, of the time. Society was a lot more fat phobic back then, and even for women who were, I don't think we would consider them like overly large today, size 10s, size 12s, those are like very, very average sizes. And I think it's interesting to see just the heavy discrimination. Even Clarice, as a pretty likable main character, has a lot of assumptions about these women and how they act and what they do just based upon how big they are. So know that going in, that I think that's the biggest thing. There's also the question of how this book handles trans representation. I don't actually think that this book does that bad of a job for when this book was published. There is some outdated terminology that we don't use today, but we were using, especially in a scientific context back in the 1980s. So know that going in. I actually think the book, from my recollections at least, does a better job than the movie of really going out there and saying, even though this person is doing bad things and might present or might not present in this way, trans people are not inherently violent, and really hammering that in. So I did appreciate that. Is it perfect when it comes to that representation? No, it's not. But I do think for when it was published, I have a feeling this maybe contributed to a lot of people kind of unpacking some of the stereotypes maybe that they did have about trans people, just because of the various doctors and professionals they interview in here that are saying things and really enforcing the fact that most often people who are trans are victims of violence rather than perpetrators. So just going into all of that, I mean, I do tread cautiously if that's something that is very triggering for you, because obviously a book written in the 1980s is not going to be as progressive and with our current understanding of sex and gender as we have in the 2020s. But I didn't think this was horrible in that regard. This is definitely a slower paced book, and I think that's going to be one of the main critiques you'll see of this book, is that it is very, very slow paced. I happen to like that. I liked from chapter 1. I was just really invested in this story, and I had a great time with it. It was a great start to this vlog. So first book down, we are now moving on to the second book in this vlog, and that is going to be Swan Song by Robert McCammon. And this one, very chunky. It is apparently a dystopian sort of epic. My library actually has this genre tagged as science fiction and not horror, so I'm really intrigued to see some sort, I think, of apocalypse or dystopian sort of story is going on in this one. I don't know pretty much anything about it other than that, so I'm gonna get to reading. I'll check back in later with an update. I am now 138 pages into Swan Song. This is over an 800-page book, at least the copy that I'm reading is. So just a little bit into this massive post-apocalyptic tome. This book follows the end of the world as we know it, and the end of the world happened in this book during World War III. Wasn't even really a war. You see at the very beginning of this, the world is in turmoil. There have been a lot of skirmishes between different countries all around the world, but it's currently like chapter 1, there's a sort of standoff between the United States and Russia, and missiles are inching closer and closer to each other, and the president of the United States is really hoping that this is just a big game of chicken. Obviously, it is not, and those missiles end up getting launched and the entire world goes up in flames. So almost 200 pages in, we get a pretty slow setup. We follow a bunch of different characters the day before everything explodes, and then we discover how they managed to survive that, and just the horrific first day of them experiencing all of the bombs and the explosions, the nuclear weapons, and the fallout, and how they managed to survive at least that first initial onslaught. It's really interesting the variety of different characters that we see. Some of them were either members of the military or people who had some sort of inkling that this was going to happen, and they were in things like bomb shelters, so they were a little more prepared, but other people just by happenstance happened to escape or be protected from the first blows. It's pretty bleak, pretty horrifying, because you obviously as the reader know from the jump that it's an end of the world type of story. So especially in the beginning, as you're following all these characters, most of them going about their day-to-day life, not realizing this is going to be the last day of normal, you kind of feel yourself on pins and needles trying to figure out how they will manage to escape this situation. And now as we see them surviving the initial blasts, what they're going to do about survival. And I'm not quite sure in what direction this book is going to head in. It is very, very lengthy, so I'm sure there's going to be more. I'm sure it's more than just a story of survival, because we have seen a couple of different characters seem to have some sort of, I don't want to say power, but some sort of ability. In particular, a very young girl nicknamed Swan, who kind of has premonitions based on the plants and the animals around her that something bad is going to happen before it happens. So we see a little bit of that, and we're introduced to a very mysterious man who does not seem like he's an actual man. He might be something a little bit different, a little bit more sinister. We get introduced to him before everything goes to flames, and you start to wonder if there is going to be some sort of final showdown between good and evil in this book. I have heard this book get compared to The Stand by Stephen King. Obviously, the inciting incidents for Apocalypse are different, but just in the case that they're both apocalypse epics, and they have that struggle between good and evil in a survival sense. So first impressions of this one are pretty good. I am intrigued. There are some characters that I'm already starting to enjoy more than others, but just with the way that this is set up and their initial potential scenarios and circumstances were also different. I think this book has done a fabulous job of course, it's going to be a slower read, but I think it did a really good job of really building that tension, building that fear and dread, and then getting to experience this horrific event through a bunch of different eyes and exploring like the worst case scenarios, best case scenarios for people who have survived, because of course they've survived the initial blast, but now they have to deal with continued survival and nuclear fallout. So I am really intrigued by where this one is going, so I'm going to go get back to reading. I'll check back in later. So I am now about 40% of the way through Swan Song. I think that's like 340 or so pages, 342 pages, and I am still enjoying it. The pace has significantly slowed down. I even mentioned in my last update that I thought it was going at a really nice pace for such a large book, and I think once we experienced before World War III, before that aftermath of all of the bombs going off and the mutually assured destruction, we followed that, the immediate, like when that happened, the day that happened, and then the immediate fallout, it slowed down significantly. We're following 3 different groups of people primarily, and I will say I think it's kind of clear from this point that we're following 2 groups of protagonists and then a group of antagonists, and the antagonists are very hard to read from, as always, in a lot of apocalypse books. It's unfortunately very sad, probably realistic, and a little bit scary how soon after a disaster happens that people just absolutely throw all morals and decency out of the window and start acting so terribly. This is a very bleak book, and I don't want to continuously compare this to The Stand, but I do think that sometimes those comparisons are a little bit inevitable, and also these 2 books published I think less than a decade apart from each other, and they're both very big, very sprawling epics of apocalypse. I will say at least at this point so far, I think The Stand is a little bit more hopeful in its tone. I definitely would want to, well, I wouldn't want to be in either book, let's get that clear, but I think unfortunately if something like this were to happen, I would want to be in the universe of The Stand. I just feel like because Captain Trips, it's a disease, and it's a really horrific disease, but once that like sweeps through and there are the survivors, there's still infrastructure left in place, there's still clean air, clean water, like I feel like there's more of a hopeful sense of something, not exactly the same society, but something could be rebuilt. This one does not have that same sense of optimism at all, because you have all the fallout, you have the environment that is just going wild with the toxic rains and storms, and there are tornadoes and hail and blizzards, and it's supposed to be August in this book, and the climate is just so unbearably terribly cold with a whole bunch of storms, and of course the fallout, and everyone is getting sick or are very severely burned. So just I feel like this one, there's just not a lot of hope, and then continuously following some of these antagonists as they're just doing horrific things and just using the collapse of society to build their own very brutalistic sort of society. So that's kind of hard to read from. There's not a lot of hope in here. I'm hoping that obviously there's a lot of this book left to go, so I am hoping that there is some sort of sense of a reason to continue on, because the prognosis for these characters is very bleak. They're all very understandably very depressed and really trying to figure out what is their purpose, how do they keep on living, and if they can figure out a way to keep on living, do they actually want to in this new world. So that's where we are so far. There are some kind of paranormal elements, I don't know, paranormal, magical sort of elements in here, where we have two characters in particular, Swan, the young girl that I mentioned before, who has some sort of power that she can kind of talk to animals and plants and understand the symbiosis of nature. So something's going to happen there. The group that she's traveling with is an ex-wrestler named Josh, and then another character, I don't really know how much is spoilers because it's very chunky. Obviously, we don't meet some of our more main characters until 200, 300 pages in. So yeah, the group she's following with, it's very clear that she should be protected. It seems like she has a bigger role to play. And then in another group, we have Sister, who finds this very mysterious glass object that seems to have magical abilities, most of all like the magic of hope. It's not too clear, but there is a character that seems to be following her and has magical abilities to shapeshift and is really desperate to get that hope, to get that object from her. So we are introducing a little bit of those elements as well combined. It's a little bit on the undercurrent right now, and the main focus for these characters is just surviving another day. So yeah, this one is going to be, it's going to be a long haul. I feel like the pace has definitely slowed down, but overall I am still cautiously enjoying it, with the caveat that it is a very pessimistic book. But I'm going to go keep reading. I'll check back in later. Now 70% of the way through Swan Song, and it's going. This is definitely a behemoth, and it's a lot. I do feel a sense of accomplishment at slowly chipping away at this one, but it is a very bleak and dreary book. I will say around the 50% mark, we actually get book 2. And book 2, the very start of it, there is a 7-year time jump, which was a little alarming at first. Honestly, I felt like this could probably have been split into 2 different books, just because tonally it was such a switch. And I guess not even tonally shifting, because this book has been pretty bleak throughout, but just the fact that we get all of this momentum and then we flip the page, it says book 2, flip the page again, and we realize 7 years have passed. And I think that some of the things maybe that happened throughout that 7-year stretch would have been interesting to see. I do get why there was a time jump, just because this book is already about 800 pages. But at the 70% mark, I will say, I think in the next section, because I just made it to section 11, the book is divided up into different sections and chapter groups. So section 11 now, I think the different groups, they're finally starting to converge with each other. We're finally seeing all of the pieces being pushed together into one central location. So hopefully the pacing will go just a little bit faster. I am worried that now we're 70% of the way through this novel, and it feels like we have a lot of ground left to cover, just with the different magical elements that are introduced and the kind of point of this story almost, because it's been a lot of suffering. This is an apocalypse book, so it just feels at times just like a lot of going from place to place and experiencing tragedy after tragedy. This is a book where you are introduced to a lot of characters and you don't really want to get attached to a lot of them. Think of it kind of like a show like The Walking Dead, where you can expect major character deaths often because of the reality of the the situation, and it just feels like every single time our characters that we're rooting for, every single time they get a little sliver, a little slice of not even normality, but just pleasure and like an excuse to keep going, not even anything huge, but even just like a wagon to keep their things in, or even just a stockpile of an extra shirt or some canned goods, things like that. The little pleasures in life, I feel like every time our characters will get something like that, the rug will get ripped out from underneath them again. So it definitely has been a lot, but I'm looking forward to wrapping up this story and seeing what the conclusion is going to hold. I finally finished Swan Song and it was okay, which is kind of a bummer because you read an almost 900-page book. This is about 850 pages and you want more of an emotional investment. Then it was fine at the end of it, but that's just kind of how this book turned out for me. It was a little bit of an uneven reading experience, and a lot of things about the end I just didn't really like. There is a specific turn in this story where all the characters are at or around a specific location, and it kind of just really turns a lot more fantastical, which I didn't really love. Some of the fantasy elements I appreciated about this, but the end really got very magical, very fantastical, and I didn't really enjoy all of that. I thought it kind of detracted from the tone of the story, and as well, a lot of the magical elements that were introduced like didn't really serve any sort of purpose and kind of felt unfinished at the end. There are a lot of loose ends at the end of this book, and the ending just felt very, very sudden. This is a long slog of a book, and I just felt overall that the character work was not as strong as it could have been. I finished this not really feeling like the characters were as fleshed out as I wanted them or expected them to be at the end of a tome, and there is a certain fantasy, or just really a certain book trope that I really don't like that happened in here, and that had to deal with good versus evil and beauty versus ugliness. There was this whole subplot, this magical subplot, that I thought could have been taken out because I didn't like the way it was handled and the implications of what it did to society. And I just felt like there were a lot of things that I expected to happen when we had characters that we saw briefly at the beginning reintroduced at the end. There are some character arcs that I was surprised that we didn't have them meet each other again. Not trying to delve into spoilers or specific characters there, but it just felt like it ended. So I really liked the beginning of this one, and there were lots of sections throughout this that really explored the desolation and the just trauma and tragedy of this event happening to the entire world, and I appreciated those sections. But I just felt like, first of all, it was divided into two books. This could have been a good duology. I think it felt long, and I love a long book. It by Stephen King is one of my favorite books, so I don't mind a tome, but this one just felt very much its length at parts. So unfortunately, like, this was fine. It wasn't something that I was upset about reading, and I do feel very accomplished to have read it, but it definitely was a significant time investment, and I'm just not quite sure that a lot of things that happened in the ending were worth that time investment necessarily. But I did finish it, chunky book under my belt, and we are moving on to the third and final book in this vlog, which is Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons, and this one is about vampires, so let's dive in. I'll check back later with another reading update. So I am now 30% of the way through Carrion Comfort. I just hit part 2 or book 2, and it is going better than I thought it would so far. So I am really glad of that. It's definitely a larger book, but I feel like the pacing, at least 30% of the way in, has been pretty great, at least for me. It is a slower book. You kind of expect that anytime a book goes above, I feel like 400 pages or so, you know it's just going to be slower paced. That's the name of the game. But I think this is introducing so many different characters, different perspectives, and different points of views that I feel like, at least so far, it's doing a really good job of keeping the pace going while being character focused, while still kind of advancing the plot forward. This does take place in December. I don't think that's going to be the case for all of the book because we are already on Christmas Eve and it's only 30% of the way through the book. But so far, this book has taken place in December of 1980, and I am really enjoying that. It's always fun when you happen to pick up a book that takes place during the same month or time of year that you're reading it. So that's a little fun coincidence. Carrion Comfort follows vampires and has to deal with vampires, but not the blood-sucking vampires, but rather energy or mind-controlling type of vampires. They get their energy, their power from controlling other people and convincing other people to do horrible things. That's how they get their sustenance. They're also not immortal like vampires who drink blood, but they're pretty close. They have like a very extended lifespan as long as they keep sucking the life force or pushing their victims to do dark things. I think this is the original cover that I have popped up on the screen here, where it's got that skeleton and it looks like a little marionette puppet. I think that's a pretty good example of what is going on here with the vampires and their abilities here. So we're following some mind vampires, and we're following a bunch of different perspectives in kind of various cat and mouse chases that are all going to converge in some way. So chapter 1 of this is actually, I've already read it before, and chapter 1 was, I don't actually know, I would probably have to go and revisit that short story collection and see if the author said anything about it, but I had actually already read chapter 1 of Carrion Comfort. It was a short story in a short story collection. I think it was an Ellen Datlow short story collection about vampires. So I had already read chapter 1 and I enjoyed it. That's what made me kind of put this on my radar a little bit. And chapter 1 of this book is essentially the same, which is actually a little bit interesting because we are following Melanie Fuller, who is one of these energy vampires, and she is at a dinner with 2 other energy vampires, and they are all talking about this game that they play together. And the game that they play is they try and rack up the most interesting kills and influence certain things in US politics and US pop culture. So like the more high profile the kill, the more points they get in this game. So they are having that round table. Melanie says that she's actually done. She wants to leave the game. You can tell that she is very disenchanted with this lifestyle, with this mind controlling sort of way, and wants to step back from it. And that is not very well received by the other 2 vampires, and it turns into a mind game and a skirmish, an altercation between her and the others. Now this really escalates in one long night of violence as we see these vampires fight and try and disable each other, but of course they are not fighting themselves. They are puppeteering other people to come after each other. So after that night of bloodshed and fighting, some of the vampires get away, some do not, and they escape. That is where the short story collection ends, and then we really move into the rest of the story. What is interesting, chapter 1 is told from Melanie's point of view. It's in first person, and that's the only time we've seen first person or seen Melanie as a POV. So I think that's a little interesting. It really makes it stand out from the rest of this story so far. I don't know if we're going to see see more of Melanie's point of view or the first person, but I did think that was really interesting, and I appreciated that. I felt like this made this book a whole lot less intimidating off the jump, that I was rereading some information that I had already read before. So we are following that, and then we also start following a bunch of people who are reacting to the events of what happened that night and are either trying to figure out what happened or cover this up. And it turns out a lot of different people, a lot of different groups are going to be searching for the survivors of the mind or energy vampires of that conflict. We learn pretty quickly on through the point of view of a man named Herod that he is tasked with tracking down the survivors of this skirmish and putting them down. They have done these really high profile things that people do not appreciate. And when I say people, I mean other mind control vampires. It turns out that there are a lot more than just 3 of these creatures, and they all tend to be in very high profile jobs or positions in society. So the government, the entertainment system, everything seems to be run by these puppeteers, and they do not like the high profile hijinks of these mind vampires from the first chapter. So they task Herod, who is also a mind vampire, with hunting down the survivors and taking them out of the equation. I do not like Herod as a main character. He is an antagonist. You're not supposed to root for him. He's very unsavory, and I really don't like reading from his point of view for one specific reason only. I mean, he's very unpleasant, very unlikable. He's supposed to be so, and Dan Simmons is not condoning his behavior because he's an antagonist. He's not a protagonist. But the way in which Herod uses his mind control powers is very, very horrific. So far, in every single POV chapter that we followed Herod in, he has found a young woman, sometimes multiple young women, and he has used his mind control powers to sexually assault them. And that's really horrific. I think chapter 2 was the first Herod chapter, and the description of that was truly horrifying, because you got in chapter 1 the implications of what these vampires could make a person do in terms of physical violence, like hurting and maiming other people, and then you got to see through Herod also the other implications of trauma and violence of a sexual nature that he could impart on other people, and they're just helpless and powerless. And it was a very hard scene to read. It was a very horrific scene to read, and really cemented the high stakesness of this situation, and I hated it. I understood why it was there. However, every single other chapter he has been in, he's done the same thing, and it has been detailed on page, and at a certain point it starts to lose that shock value. The first chapter he's in, completely horrific, taken off guard, you can't believe it's happening, and now that you can believe it's happening, you know it's a part of his character, you're just like, okay, who is he going to victimize this time? And just those scenes read not necessarily gratuitous, because it's not like you're supposed to enjoy them or anything, but just the fact we keep getting these scenes, I don't necessarily think that we need them long and drawn out. We can fade to black or have the implication that he's continuously doing this and then keep the story moving along. So I don't love that. We are also following a man named Saul, who is searching out these people as well. He's actually been searching out one of these mind controlling vampires. He's been searching him out since he had an encounter with him during the Holocaust. Saul is Polish and Jewish, and he was a victim during the Holocaust. He was put in a concentration camp where he ran up against one of these mind vampires and has been searching for him ever since to try and get revenge. I also think that's kind of interesting. Swan Song had this as well, in that Swan Song, it was more they adopted like Nazi insignia and Nazi thoughts and stuff like that to bring about a new world order after apocalypse. This one is very much, a lot of the antagonists happened to be Nazis or be Nazi supporters, because 1980, that's only 40 years after the events of the Holocaust, and World War II. So I do think it's interesting that these two books in the 80s really feature Nazism heavily and feature Nazism as the antagonist. But I did think it was interesting because the vastly different subject matters, they both have that as an antagonistic force. But anyway, Saul and a police chief and someone else who was impacted by the events of the night of chapter 1, they band together and they're going to try and stop these mind vampires themselves. So 30% of the way in, we have all of these groups being set up. They are chasing these vampires for very different reasons and different motives, and I'm very curious to see where this book is going to go from there. This is going to be a shorter update because I don't actually have that much more to say about Carrion Comfort, but I am 50% of the way through it, so about 400 pages and some change, and I am enjoying it. It definitely at times feels its length, but overall I do think that it's going at a speedy enough pace where it doesn't feel like any parts are necessarily dragging, and I did feel that way about The Terror. So I felt like that one, while I really enjoyed parts of it, one of the issues that I had with it was it just felt a little bit bloated at times. This so far doesn't feel like that. However, I will say 50% of the way in, I feel like things are coming to a head. I feel like because I am reading it on my iPad, I'm reading the ebook, I feel like I'm closer to the end than I actually am. So I'm anticipating a lot of mix-ups and change-ups to happen in the latter 50%, because right now it really does feel like we're at the climax of the story and that everything is coming to a head. So I am really curious to see how the latter 50% of this one is going to go. So just a short update, it's still going, and I am kind of very intrigued to see where this is going to go, because it does have to switch things up a little bit just because it feels like what we've been moving to is almost resolved. So something new has to happen to shake up this cat and mouse game to avoid this one becoming a little bit repetitive. So I'm curious to see how this author is going to do that. So I have finished Carrion Comfort and it was okay. I actually did enjoy this, I think, overall more than I did The Terror, but I do think, unfortunately, this author I just don't think is for me. I definitely said in my last update that it felt like the book was drawing to a conclusion, and I was worried and interested to see how it would progress from that point, because it did feel very much like we were in the middle of the book's climax with a lot more to go. And I think the like 60 to 75% mark, which is a lot of pages in this behemoth, I felt like really slowed down and could have been condensed. And I hate saying that because I feel like you could make that argument for any large tome, is that of course the story could be told in a shorter amount of pages. Even books that I love, I could definitely see how a lot of people would say you could trim this down, and objectively I could even say, well, maybe you could trim this down and it would just be a shorter story. But I did feel like this one felt just a little repetitive at times. There were several scenes, several action scenes or influential scenes where we would read the scene and then we would switch chapters, switch to a new point of view, and then we'd start the scene over. And for, I would say one in specific, but for a couple of them, I did think that was pretty effective for some of those scenes, because some of them had to deal with unexpected characters entering or events happening happening concurrently that you didn't realize were happening concurrently. So I did appreciate that sometimes, and I thought that was a pretty valuable storytelling tool. However, I felt like a lot of these scenes, we didn't need to repeat them over again, or we could have just had the scene and switched POV from POV so we could get that big picture. I didn't think for some of these scenes that we revisited 2, sometimes 3 times, I didn't necessarily think we needed that for every large action scene. And I do think that the action, espionage, high octane chase sort of scenes are not Simmons' strength, and they do go on a while. However, I will say I feel like the ending, it nails the landing. So this is a book where I do kind of feel like even if you're feeling a little fatigued by the end and you manage to make your way to the end thematically and just the way that things come together, I don't think you'll be disappointed by it. I think the ending is pretty strong. This book, like any other books, is definitely a product of its time, but this one in particular, to the way that world events and different nations were portrayed, Israel like had a really big role in this book. And I do think that's interesting, and I can see from the time period it was written and then also the time period that this took place, because it was slightly mismatched there for when the book came out versus the year that it was spanning. I see why, especially if you have a Jewish protagonist that survived the Holocaust, why there would be some mentions of Israel, but I didn't love how involved the Israeli government and secret services were for this story. And I am interested to see, like, if this book was written today, what would be changed about those aspects, because I can definitely see how Saul, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, would think very highly of Israel. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that there are some critiques of Israel in here, and the different characters that are involved in that aspect of the plot. Trying not to dive too much into spoilers, but I do think there is some nuance. Like, all of the Jewish characters, they're not one-dimensional, and they have very different opinions about Israel and Israel's actions, and I'm curious to see kind of how that would play out today. I definitely thought that was a choice, having the Israeli secret services and also just the government play such a big part in this book, where I felt like you could have done this same exact story but just had it be focused on the American government. So I did think that was interesting, and it kind of took me aback, but definitely interesting to kind of see the different perspectives of different nations and allies and such of the United States, and kind of exploring a little bit of those political aspects. So I definitely wanted to bring that up because this book does take place 1980, 1981, and just kind of exploring some of the political dynamics between countries at that time, which was very interesting. And I think another thing about the 1980s, having read these 3 books, is that these books were not afraid to really make you sit with unpleasant characters and really follow antagonists, and almost not necessarily be like a devil's advocate, but they really got into the nitty-gritty of, this is an evil person, you're following them, you have to listen to every single one of their thoughts. And of course their thoughts are quite cruel. We follow rapists and racists in this one, and just genuinely downright evil people, and that can be very pessimistic to read pages and pages and pages of these monologues. And I don't think we necessarily get that in books today. I understand why, but I do think it's interesting just how much time for a couple of these books that we had to spend inside the minds of literal Nazis. And it's something that I don't think people really attempt to execute today. Definitely not very pleasant, but it definitely hammers the points home of how evil these antagonists are. So overall, I'm really glad that I did this vlog. I did think it was pretty successful. I mean, I absolutely loved The Silence of the Lambs. I'll definitely be reading more from Thomas Harris. That's by far my favorite book that I read, technically reread for this vlog, but I am glad that I got to the other 2 books as well. I've heard so much about them. They're modern-ish classics, and I am glad that I gave them a go. I think it was was interesting to kind of see the different themes throughout all three of them, and kind of getting a little snapshot of what horror looked like at the time. I thought it was interesting. I think I already mentioned that Nazism was big to use as an antagonist in two of the books, and then the other two felt very much like a detective thriller type of horror, which you can see that in movies as well. I feel like late 80s, early 90s, we're seeing a lot of horror books and horror movies as well kind of lean into detective crime thriller. Like we have that blend of the gritty, realistic reality horror mixed alongside thriller. So definitely got to see a snapshot of some of the trends of the time, and I did appreciate just kind of delving into three books that definitely felt of their time, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways, but just kind of experiencing three very different voices that are different than what I typically end up reading and what I've been reading this year. So I did really appreciate this experiment and really had a lot of fun diving into some backlist books. So definitely let me know if you'd like me to continue on and read some of the 1990s Bram Stoker winners. But thank you all so much for watching this vlog. I know it was a long one. We had two books that were around 800 pages, and I had a lot to say about all of these books, so I appreciate you if you've made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next one. Bye!